Hi everyone, it's Laura and I hope you're all doing really well. Today I'm going to be reviewing all of the books that I read in the second half of April. If you'd like to see what I read in the first half, I will link that video up here and in the description box below. I read many books this month, mostly because I did a challenge over Easter to try and read as many short books as possible. So there's a couple here left over from that weekend and some new ones. As always, all of these will be linked in the description box below as well, if you'd like to check them out for yourself. I'll start with the last two books that I read as part of that reading challenge because I didn't really talk about them that much in the vlog. So the first one is The Shepherd's Life by James Rebanks, and this is a non-fiction book about James Rebanks and his life. He's a shepherd in the Lake District, which is in the north of England in Cumbria, and it's a place I absolutely love. We go on holiday there, I feel like at least once a year. We did have 2 weeks booked to go there over Easter, which obviously we moved. So instead of being in the Lake District, I thought reading about it would put me in that countryside mood. This is partly a look at a general shepherd's life in the Lake District, looking at their routines in spring, summer, autumn, winter, and why that nature of farming and shepherding is the way it is in the Lake District. It's quite an ancient way of farming, and it's part a look at James Rebanks' own history, his family. He talks a lot about his grandfather who set up the farm that he now farms, and his relationship and memories of his grandfather, but also his father as well, and the way farming and shepherding is so generational. It was really interesting for me to see about the real lives behind the landscape, and I really loved that aspect of the book. A lot of what James Rebanks talks about when he was growing up is that he didn't really understand why people came to the Lake District on holiday, and when he looked at writings of Wordsworth, for example, he's like, that's not the kind of landscape that I recognise, that's not my life. And the juxtaposition between people going there for leisure on holiday and almost feeling like they own the mountains and the lakes as it's part of our own national heritage, as opposed to him and his family and the local people that live there, and them feeling like this is our landscape, we're the ones that work it. The reason it looks so picturesque is because of our sheep, and those walls are maintained because we maintain them. And I really appreciated that perspective, because that's not one I see. I am one of those people who turns up there and walks the fells and loves it and thinks it'd be great to live there, but I'm not of that place. It's a national park, but really it's stewarded and maintained by the shepherds and by this kind of ancient traditional working class work. So I really appreciated that. I think if you like the Lake District and you like English countryside in general, you will find this really interesting. It's hard for me to know how to recommend it because it is quite niche, but I really enjoyed the experience of reading it. And the last book I read as part of that weekend was Sula by Toni Morrison, which I really loved the experience of reading. As with a lot of her work, it's almost quite difficult to explain because there is a plot, but really the book itself is grappling with a lot more themes than what is superficially the plot. So on the back that this says this is about a friendship between two girls, Nell and Sula, and how they grow up in this town, and then Sula goes away and she comes back, and it's about the girl that stayed at home and the girl that went away. That's not really what this book is about. As with reading Toni Morrison's work before, I just really enjoy reading her writing. It feels like diving into a river and just being carried along, really. It's so easy to read, but also so visceral and physical. I really love the worlds she creates as she writes. And the story in this book, really, it is about Nell and Sula, but really it's about their extended families and the town that they find themselves in. It did really remind me of the magical realism of, say, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, because it's about love and familial love and the really harrowing pain of slavery and how that ripples through generations and how that kind of pain and suffering becomes normalised. And lots of odd things happen to the people in this book, and lots of dreadful things happen to them, and the dreadful things that happen just are almost like another sentence or another page, and it's just something they have to deal with and move on. But that trauma never really goes away. The way parents show love to children is almost through suffering themselves rather than necessarily showing them love. And there's just so much floating around in this book. It is about the racism inflicted upon this community and the pain and suffering and poverty that's within this community, but it's also about women, and it's about motherhood and sexuality and femininity and I guess friendship between women as well as girls and as they move into adulthood. And I almost wish I hadn't been reading this book as part of a challenge to read as many books as possible, because I read it basically in one go, and I feel like almost I didn't get a chance to properly savour the writing in the way that I should have done. Next, I picked up The Confessions of Franny Langdon, which won the Costa First Novel Award this year, and I was really excited to read this because I'm really in the mood for historical fiction at the moment, and I was so disappointed by this book. I'm really upset. I finished it. It's not like I hated the book, but I feel like it had so much potential and it didn't quite get there. This is about Franny, who is a former slave from the colonies in Jamaica. She's brought over to London, and at the beginning of the book she's on trial for the murder of her master and mistress in London. And she then goes back, she's writing this book to her lawyer, which I think was a bit of an odd device. Number one, I didn't really like that framing, to explain how she got to where she got, and it's by the end of it you're finding out whether or not she committed the crime and how it all happened. As a premise, I thought that was brilliant, and right at the beginning when she's describing her childhood in Jamaica, I was really on board with it. However, I think the main issue throughout this entire book is so much is implied to the point where I didn't understand what was going on. So for example, right at the beginning of the book, she's living on a plantation with Mr. Langdon, and there is a point where he's asking her to do something. She gets to a certain age and he's like, yes, in that shed, a thing will happen. And it's literally as vague as that. And it all builds up to this moment where he's asking her to do something, and then the next page, it's like, I don't know, like something else is going on, or there's a fire, or something's happened, and I felt like I had missed chapters. And I think what she was trying to do is not give everything away too early, and she's trying to, I guess, create some mystery and leave some gaps in your knowledge which will then be filled in later. But I didn't feel like she set you up enough to be able to realise that you had these gaps on purpose. It made me feel like I didn't understand what was going on, and it wasn't just major plot points where this technique was being used. It felt like this was her style, which was being carried through the book. So even at one point when she's in London serving this couple, the housekeeper's angry at her at some point. She mentions something about the flash of a kettle, and then it's the next day and her arm is hurting, and it's like, okay, so what happened then? So did you knock into the kettle? Was the kettle hot? Did the housekeeper whack you with the kettle? Did she pour boiling water on you? I don't know. You've left too much to my imagination there. I don't understand what's happened. And it was frustrating because this is a mystery novel, because you don't know how these people have been murdered. And she's simultaneously spoon feeding you in some instances, because in between this confession, in between the chapters, there's testimony from people in the court. So some things that you wouldn't have found out from Franny's perspective are just being told to you blatantly. And at the same time, she's leaving so many holes at parts of the plot which don't seem to really matter. They're not to do with the mystery. They seem quite fundamental and things I should understand, and she's making you guess a little bit too much. And the reason I found it so disappointing is because I actually really liked the story. I liked what she was trying to say about slavery in the UK, essentially, about people who wanted to ban slavery, but at the same time were living in London and didn't have to see black people, didn't have to see slaves, didn't have to see the sugar plantations, which brought in the money that they then lived off of. And the way she's treated in the plantations, as opposed to the way she's treated in London, the way these people still want to see themselves as better because they're white, even if they still think slaves shouldn't be beaten, for example. There's lots of things which were really interesting in here. And I actually quite liked the way the plot unfolded and the way it ended. I think it could have been something really good, but it felt like she'd almost thrown it away. Next, I finished Weather by Jenny Offal, which was the pick for April and May for my Patreon book club. So I will be reviewing this as part of my Patreon channel, so you can subscribe to that if you're interested in joining the book club. I'll leave details in the description box below. I had a lot of thoughts on this. It's difficult. I think I gave this about 3 stars. I was like, yes and no. So I'll talk about that in that video. And finally, I read Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng, which I really enjoyed. This is about two families, the Richardsons, who own a very large house in this very formal, intentional neighbourhood, and they have a rental property which they rent out to Mia, who's a single mum with her daughter Pearl, and Pearl is the same age as some of the children in the Richardson family. She goes to their school, and it's about their lives getting a little bit too entangled, and it's also mainly about Mrs. Richardson, who is a very meddlesome white woman. She and her whole family are very entitled and very careless, and they're not nasty people, but they're very presumptive in some ways, and the families start to become intertwined when Mrs. Richardson asks Mia to clean their house because she thinks she's helping her out because Mia's an artist, and she's like, oh, wouldn't that be so nice? I'll let her clean her house, I'll do a good turn for her, which isn't really that useful to Mia, but she feels like she can't say no. And then the tensions and also the over familiarity that there is in some places between these two families erupts when there is a case of a young Chinese baby who had been abandoned and adopted by this white couple, and the mother now wants custody of her again, and there's a whole case around this baby, which then sort of causes different parts of their lives to unravel. I thought this was a great book. It's very readable, commercial fiction, suburban American town, contemporary lives and families, but it really dealt with a lot of interesting themes, especially about race and class, and I thought all of the characters were written very believably, very, very well, and you understood all their motives, and you really knew who these types of people were. And the fact this is set in the 90s as well, I think really does work to its advantage, as it's in that time before a lot of the more nuanced conversations about race and culture and multiculturalism in general have been discussed as much as they are now, for example. I feel like this was really before that point where people thought being colourblind was the best way to get rid of racism. And I'm really glad I enjoyed it as well, because there was a lot of hype when this came out, and I feel like I understand why a lot of people enjoyed it. I really want to read her first book now, Everything I Never Told You, and I'm also really excited for I think it's a series that's coming out with Reese Witherspoon in it, which I think she's going to do really well. So let me know if you've read any of these books. I would love to hear your thoughts on them, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!